Hello, I am Joseph Schofer. I'm Professor Emeritus of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Northwestern University. I'm still teaching at Northwestern University on a part-time basis, and I am a fan of infrastructure. The Panama Canal is an amazing and large piece of infrastructure. It's an engineering marvel of the world. 108 years after the opening of the Panama Canal, it continues to function in good form, playing a central role in global logistics. In this discussion, I will share with you insights into how the Panama Canal was built and what we can learn from that experience. Its construction, it turns out, was relatively recent, so records remain in the National Archives and in the Historic American Engineering Record, and also in collections around the country that were donated to libraries by workers returning from their experience on the Panama Canal. In this talk, I'll use some of those materials, particularly some historic photographs. This is going to be an engineering talk, focusing on engineering and management history, not the political history of the Panama Canal, which is wonderfully interesting and very well documented. And I encourage you to pursue that and to read that. So I'm going to talk about 4 keys to the development of the Panama Canal. One is improving the quality of the environment to make the Panama Canal a safe and secure place to work. The second is selecting a design that's cost effective, that's feasible and efficient, particularly the debate between building a lock canal, which was the ultimate winner, and a sea level canal. I'll talk some about the tools that were used and the technologies and how they made a difference. And finally, we'll talk about the overall strategy, which it turns out was really focused on excavating material and moving the dirt, 260 million cubic yards of earth that were moved for the construction of the canal. You know, there's been a long interest in creating a link across the Isthmus of Panama, which is the narrowest crossing of Central America, for the purpose of facilitating commerce and generating profits. The French entrepreneur Ferdinand de Lesseps orchestrated the construction of the Suez Canal over the decade ending in 1869. Viewed from his location in France, Panama looked like his next big financial adventure. He, in his view, was the expert, and he could do this job. Now, Panama was already an important trade route with goods and people exchanged from ship to railroad and back from railroad to ship on its north and south coasts. In 1849, it was the quickest route to the California gold rush, by sea from the East Coast or the Gulf Coast to Panama, across the isthmus by rail, and back by sea to California. At that point in history, the railroad trip cost $25, which was the most costly rail trip in the world on a per mile basis. Remember, the US Transcontinental Railroad was not connected until 1869. And what became the Panama Canal Railroad still exists today, functions very, very effectively, and it's actually run by the Kansas City Southern Railroad. De Lesseps worked on building a sea level canal, like the Suez, that was his experience, across Panama from 1881 until 1904, when his company went bankrupt. The U.S. interest in the Isthmian Canal was driven by a different motivation. It was a strategic motivation rather than economic. We wanted to assure a naval presence in both the Atlantic and in the Pacific Oceans, and the journey around Cape Horn was a long and tedious one. The alternative was maintaining an armada in both oceans. The proof of the value of a shortcut between the seas came in 1898, when the battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. It was believed initially that this was a terrorist attack related to the Spanish-American War. It turns out later investigations pretty much showed that this was an accident. But in response, the battleship Oregon was dispatched from San Francisco to the Caribbean. This was a 14,000-mile journey around Cape Horn. It involved 5 refueling stops. These were coal-powered ship, and it took 67 days. And it underscored the value of having a connection that was faster and shorter, arguably through the Isthmus of Panama. Teddy Roosevelt was active in the decision-making, first as Assistant Secretary of the Navy until 1898, and later as President of the United States from 1901 to 1909. And so he presided really over the building of the Panama Canal, although he was out of office when it was completed. What were the challenges? Why was this a big project? Why is it an interesting project? Well, it was 2,000 miles from home. Was that important? Yes, it meant the supply lines were 2,000 miles long. It took a long time to move materials. It was possible to communicate very rapidly because there were undersea cables connecting many parts of the world at that point in time, but communication was very expensive. Living conditions in Panama were more than primitive. The risk of serious disease and death was very serious, particularly from malaria and yellow fever. Malaria, turns out, was caused by a parasite, yellow fever by a virus, and neither were treatable. Turns out yellow fever was actually endemic along the Gulf Coast of the United States and even in Washington, D.C., but it still wasn't manageable. There was essentially no infrastructure to support construction activity in Panama, and the scale was massive. And I already threw a number out at you: 260 million cubic yards. That's something to remember. We'll come back to that. The French worked from 1881 to 1904. U.S. finished the job in a decade, 1904 to 1914. That was pretty fast for those days. So let's talk about the four keys to the canal. First, providing the right environment, essentially protecting people from disease as a first step. One of the interesting historical facts is it turns out that medical researchers were talking about the role of the mosquito as a vector in carrying malaria and yellow fever as early as 1848, probably earlier, but that's the earliest we could find in the literature. It was nearly 6 decades before the construction of the Panama Canal, and it took that long for decision makers and the public to accept the notion that the mosquito was the carrier of these diseases. There were many articles in the medical literature over that period of time, but it took a long time for those to be accepted. This is sort of a lesson for today. We're seeing a similar kind of problem when we find that scientific facts are sometimes disputed because people are opposed or people don't understand. I think one of the issues associated with the disbelief that mosquitoes were a vector was it was not possible for people to see the cause of the diseases. They couldn't see the parasites. They certainly couldn't see the virus, didn't know the viruses existed. And so it was easier to take cheap and close at hand solutions. So the diseases were attributed to miasma. So if you look up miasma is foul odors arising from dead things in the soil, which really had nothing to do with the spread of disease. It turns out Walter Reed, who was quite a famous physician, worked on malaria and yellow fever and linked them to their spread to mosquitoes. His protege, William Gorgas, was working with him in Havana and took the action of trying to eliminate mosquitoes propagation in Havana and was able to wipe out yellow fever in a period of 2 months. Very rapid impact. Here's the rest of the timeline. And the first chief engineer of the Panama Canal was John Wallace. John Wallace was skeptical about the role of mosquitoes. Oddly enough, he was highly educated, but didn't seem to accept that. The second chief engineer came in a year later. We'll get into that story in a moment. And that was John Stevens. And Stevens accepted the theories that Gorgas brought to him, opened the door and made resources available to Gorgas to direct the fight against mosquitoes. And yellow fever and malaria death rates dropped essentially to 0 in a year. And so you can see the death rates there. Very, very important breakthrough, really based on scientific knowledge. And the actions taken were pretty simple and pretty direct. Really, it was a matter of controlling the breeding of mosquitoes, either by destroying their habitat, which was standing water, which is where the larvae grew, or where they couldn't get rid of the standing water through drainage. They would suffocate the larvae by spraying a larvicide, usually an oil substance that cut off the flow of air. This was a very, very successful breakthrough, and it made a huge difference in our ability to construct the Panama Canal safely and securely and efficiently in a decade. So there were a lot of simple steps that were taken to defeat the mosquitoes, to reduce the death rate and make this a really good place to work. Turns out that at this point in history, for technical professionals, particularly engineers, working on the Panama Canal was the best job you could have. The money was good, the environment was safe. Part of the environmental investments involve providing a piped water system, a piped clean water system, paving the alleys to get rid of standing water in the city of Colón, which is the primary construction center, and providing housing for the workers, good quality housing. So housing for the bachelor workers is shown on the slide on the upper left. You can see it screened. That's another mosquito fighting action. Housing for married workers was also provided. It's interesting that the employers at the time encouraged their professional workers to be married and to bring their families to Panama because it was safe and because management was convinced that they'd get more productivity from happier workers. Very different kind of approach to managing a workforce than had been adopted in the past. In fact, and this image is from 1910. By 1910, Panama was a vacation center for wealthy people living in the continental United States. This is an excursion train that brought people to the Culebra Cut, which, if you remember, is the Continental Divide. It's the deepest cut on the construction of the Panama Canal, and people are here on vacation. One of the things to note that I find interesting is the way people dress. So it's a lot of white clothing. Why white clothing? Well, it's a tropical paradise, if you will, and it was traditional to wear white. And we'll see that the professional workers in actually dressed in similar fashion. Okay, so first the United States built an environment which was an appealing environment and a safe environment in which to work. Very critical and important that came first. Particularly came first under the direction of the second chief engineer, who was John Stevens. The second key to the canal was finding a right design, really making the decision to select either a sea level canal or a lock canal. People were very familiar with sea level canals. De Lesseps had pushed that very hard because that's what he knew and all he knew. However, the construction environment in the context in Egypt, where the Suez Canal is located, is radically different than anything you see in Panama, which is a rainforest, a mountainous area, where digging a sea level canal would have been a special challenge. What's the advantage of a sea level canal? Well, you wouldn't have spent time in locks, which take quite a while to move through. So transit time for ships would be much faster. If it were enlarged, it would be faster still. If it were be enlarged, and it would have been built as a very narrow waterway to save construction costs and time. And it wouldn't have locks, and locks are vulnerable to failure, to accidents, to delays, and to terrorism. It's if you want to shut down a canal, the quickest way to do it is to close up the locks. And without locks, the operation of the Panama Canal would have been a lot cheaper on a per ship basis. So what are the advantages of a lock canal? Well, the feasibility studies indicated that because there would have been substantially less excavation, a lock canal would have been cheaper by half. It would have been faster by half. It was possible to build a lock canal by damming the Chagres River, and I'll show you an illustration of that, which flooded on an annual basis, created a water situation that was very hard to navigate. And by damming that river, a lake was created, and the lake was 24 miles long. The whole isthmus is only 48 miles long. So half the distance did not require excavation, or did not require much excavation. So that really led to the savings of money and time for construction. And it was possible to build wider and deeper channels because you didn't have to dig down so far. And we'll try to illustrate that in a moment. This debate really went on from the de Lesseps era through a final decision that was made in 1906. It turns out that it was made by the president and by the Congress. It was a bill passed in the Congress. Teddy Roosevelt was president by then and signed that bill on June 30, 1906. So I find it fascinating that the United States was involved in building the Panama Canal since 1904, but it was 2 years downstream from that before they made a commitment to building a lock canal, a fundamental design commitment. But it was a well thought out commitment. It was a well argued commitment. If you can find online, or I could help you find online when we get to the question and answers session, the original documentation, the original study done by the 1906 Isthmian Canal Commission, which is quite thorough and quite detailed, makes a really strong case for a lock canal. So, and here are the votes. It's always kind of interesting to look at the votes of these two commissions. The International Board of Consulting Engineers in 1905 voted 8-5 in favor of a sea level. This was made up by some Americans and some Europeans, and the Europeans really favored the sea level canal. The Isthmian Canal Commission was an all-American commission, and the vote was 5-1 in favor of a lock canal. What's interesting is the minority report that came out of the International Board of Consulting Engineers, which spoke very directly and specifically about the advantages of the lock canal, really carried the day in the meetings of the Isthmian Canal Commission. So what's the difference? Why is there such a big difference? So this is a diagram of a cross-section of the Isthmus of Panama at the location of the Panama Canal. The Pacific Ocean is on the right. It's over here, if you can see my cursor. And the Atlantic Ocean, or really the Caribbean, is on the left. And you can look at the terrain, and what you're looking at is a cross-section through the continental divide. So rain on to the right of this peak drains into the Pacific, and to the left drains into the Atlantic. If a sea level canal were constructed, this mustard color area represents the amount of excavation that would have been needed. This is what the majority report of the International Board of Consulting Engineers recommended. This is a lot of excavation. Now, if you're following along, you should understand that the vertical scale in this diagram is greatly exaggerated so we can see it and understand it. But what we're doing is trying to compare a sea level canal, which is the mustard color excavation, with the lock canal, which is represented in the lower diagram, really the same diagram, but here I've shaded in red the amount of excavation necessary for a lock canal. And it is much less, very significantly less. And part of the trick was to build this dam. This is the dam in cross-section at Gatun on the Caribbean side, a very large earth-filled dam, a dam that's about 2 miles long, a very substantial and impressive design in terms of its construction. And that dam collected the water coming in from the Chagres River, which is about here on the isthmus, and flowing to the Atlantic side. It collected that water and made a lake that was 24 miles long, 23.5 miles long. And here, virtually no excavation was necessary. There were a few peaks. These were really hills on the landslide and on the land side that were inundated with water collected by the dam. So the difference is huge. And this is a huge difference in time, a huge difference in cost. It comes entirely from the advantage of choosing to do a lock canal and excavating substantially less material. So here's another cross section. This probably won't make a difference to you, but this is looking south at Gold Hill. So where's Gold Hill? Gold Hill is the continental divide. It's the highest point in the Isthmus of Panama. It required the most construction. So we're looking south toward the Pacific. The area excavated by the French is represented by the area under this dashed line down to about here. That's a lot. They accomplished quite a bit. The area excavated by the United States is is represented by this gray shaded line, which is a lot as well. So here is the basic excavation, and here is the depth represented by the canal itself. In this case, it was about 40 feet deep. It's subsequently been deepened by about 10 more feet. If the United States had made the decision to build a sea level canal, here's the extra excavation that would have been necessary. So that's the first lift to get down to sea level. The second is to widen that excavation to address the fact that landslides were very common. And if you didn't widen it that much and didn't go a little bit deeper, it would have been a matter of clearing slides on a regular basis. So this is the difference between this brown shaded area is the difference between a sea level canal and a lock canal. Again, a very substantial increase in excavation. So let me digress for a minute and say, and answer the question, how does a lock canal work? And think about it this way. We created this big lake by building a dam. It was essentially in the center of Panama. The ships need to go up 87 feet and down 87 feet to transit the Isthmus of Panama. They do that in a series of locks, 3 steps up, 3 steps down. The Gatun Dam that I told you about at the north end creates this lake, Lake Gatun. Lake Gatun stores fresh water from the Chagres River, really coming from the rainforest. As ships transit the canal, fresh water is released step by step to the oceans. For each transit, up 3 steps, down 3 steps, 52 million gallons of fresh water flow to the oceans. So you need a lot of fresh water to make this canal work. That dam captured that fresh water, acted as a storage place for the fresh water. And the Panama Canal works with no pumps. That is, it works entirely on the basis of gravity. Water starts at the top, the rain falls, the river flows, the dam captures the water, and the water flows as the gates of the dam, of the locks open and close and allow ships to pass. Gravity only, no pumps. But fresh water is absolutely essential to make this work. And if not enough water, and you can't make the canal work. Initially, that was not an issue. Contemporaneously, now, today, drought and high level of activity in the Panama Canal make water shortage a threat to the operation of the canal. One thing to get from this picture is you see these little locomotives that are on the sides of the lock. Here's a locomotive over here, and it looks like there's about 3 on this side, and they're connected to the ship by wires. Their only function is to keep the ship in the center of the lock. They don't pull the ships. They've never pulled the ships. The ships have always gone through the Panama Canal under their own power, and the locomotives, which still exist today in a more modern form, only center the ships and control it laterally. So what's the third key to the canal? The third key was to have the right tools to build rapidly by using high capacity tools. The French technology was small and slow and very labor intensive. So if you look at some of the photographs that I'll share with you and others you'll find in historical literature, in all of the cases where you're looking at French construction, the ratio of personnel to equipment is very high. They use a lot of hand labor to make this work. This is a French excavator that was used in the Calabre cut, the deepest cut. Gold Hill is on one side, Contractor Hill on the other side. This is a very low capacity, slow moving machine. And it's one of the reasons why the French were not successful. Here's another picture of French excavating technology. Actually, de Lesseps was forced in 1887 to build some locks on a temporary basis because his financial backers said it's going to take too long for us to start seeing revenue for this canal, so you've got to do something. He was not successful at this. Here's American technology. This is one of the really important keys to the canal. This is an American Bucyrus steam shovel. It was built in the Midwest, I think either in Ohio or it was built in Milwaukee. It says it right there. Built in Milwaukee. A lot of the equipment came from the Midwest, from Milwaukee, from Bay City, Michigan, from Ohio. And this was very heavy duty stuff compared to what the French used. This is a rail-based shovel. So why rail-based shovel? Well, we didn't have high capacity, high load bearing rubber tires. We didn't have diesel engine tractors like we have today. The only way to carry a load as heavy as this shovel was to put it on rails. And that made it quite inflexible. And what that meant was every time you moved the site of excavation a few feet in this direction or that, you had to relay the rails. You had to move the rails. And they developed some innovative local technology for doing this pretty efficiently. So this was a steam-powered machine. It was coal-fired, so they had to ship coal to Panama and move it to the construction sites. That was another role of the railroads. It had a 10-person crew and an engineer to operate the motion of the vehicle, a crane operator, 2 firemen, that is to keep the boiler running, and 6 move-up men. What's a move-up man? A move-up man is a guy that helps move this shovel to the next location as it proceeds and makes progress. This shovel had a 5 cubic yard bucket, which was 8 times faster and bigger than the French bucket loaders. As I said, it was made in Milwaukee. Remember that the excavation task was 260 million cubic yards to be moved and removed. The French had moved 30 million before they left Panama. Landslides, brought back another 25 million cubic yards. So it was always a matter of digging and experiencing a slide and then digging out again and continue the construction process. The equipment used today on the modernization of the Panama Canal, which was completed in 2016, was all diesel-powered, rubber-tired vehicles, much more mobile, much more capacious. So the capacity of a bucket on one of those shovels was not 5 cubic yards, it was 25 cubic yards. So our capability to construct has expanded very considerably over the years. The motivation was to keep the shovels working, to let them work continuously, to pull trains to carry the spoils in front of the shovels, so the tracks were always being moved, and under the best of conditions to operate the train slowly without stopping and continuing to load one car after another. This is another Bucyrus steam-powered shovel, and the cars are French cars. Very low capacity cars, and we'll show you what the Americans used in a moment. And that's here. You'll see the difference is that these cars they're larger, longer, and they have a wall on one side to catch the material, but they were clear on the other side. And what that meant was that they could be unloaded very rapidly. This is a big shovel, fascinating to me. Here's again a field engineer standing on top of the rock in this rail car, wearing his white suit and wearing a jacket. Remember, this is the tropics. This is 95 degrees and 100% humidity, but this is the way people dressed in those days. Also does not have any of the safety gear that we would require today. This was a very intense project. This is the Culebra cut, again, the deepest cut on the Panama Canal at the point of the Continental Divide. And in this photograph, you can see 6 levels of excavation going on at once. So I'll try to point them out with my cursor. Here's the first, here's the second, here's the third, here's the fourth, here's the fifth, here's the 6th. This is a lot of railroad mileage. In fact, this is a very old photo. You can see that on the negative, the photographer actually wrote the details of the location and the date of the photo. And these are typical of what you find in the National Archives. Concrete for the locks was made on a continuous basis with a mixing device here. What you see is a berm crane. So this is a berm that we're looking at, a pile of earth. It's not really earth. This is gravel. This is sand over here. You mix the two with cement, which comes in on rail cars The mixing apparatus is here, the concrete mixing apparatus is here, and it goes out on rail cars to the construction site. So very efficient, intense construction activity and very large scale activity to provide the sufficient amount of concrete to build the locks. That concrete, if we go to the Panama Canal and look at the locks today, is what it is. It's still functioning. It looks old, but it looks very sturdy, and it works really well. One of the interesting connections for me is the connection to the Midwest and to construction equipment used and manufactured in the Midwest. This is a photograph of the construction of the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal in 1895. So this is before the United States got into the Panama Canal building business. What was this project? This was a project to reverse the Chicago River for the purpose of draining the sewage from the city of Chicago, not into Lake Michigan where we take our drinking water, but downstream into the Illinois River and eventually to the Mississippi River. This crane looks very much like this device here and similar devices that were used in the Panama Canal. This is made by the Brown Hoist Company, which is in Bay City, Michigan, on the eastern coast of Michigan. Here's a scene that shows construction of the locks and the lock gates. Very large when you look at it this way. When it's drained of water, it doesn't look all that large when you're there, but this is a really large piece of construction. The gates weigh between 600 and 900 tons, and they're fully removable for maintenance and repair. In some cases, you see a double set of locks here, which is a safety feature to make sure that we didn't lose all the water in Lake Gatun if some of the lock gates failed. The fourth key to the canal is having the right strategy, and really the right leadership came with the right strategy. The challenge was to remove the spoils, to remove the dirt that was dug. That amount was equivalent to 23 American football fields, including the end zones, that was 23 miles high. That's a lot of earth to move. And where did it go? It went to the Gatun Dam. That was an earth-filled dam. It went to the breakwaters at both oceans, and it went to spoils dumps all along the way. The railroad, it turns out, was the backbone. It was the lifeline. Materials moved, people moved, spoils moved, energy moved, coal was shipped. The first chief engineer was a railroad guy, John Wallace. He came in as the chief engineer of the Illinois Central Railroad, which starts in Chicago and goes south. It's now part of the Canadian National Railroad. He got a salary of $25,000 a year, which is a huge salary at that point in time. And he rebuilt the railroad. He focused on that. He got into some trouble. I'll get back to that in a moment. He had conflicts with the Isthmian Canal Commission, which he felt was micromanaging the project from afar, which it apparently was. And he left after a year. He resigned under a conflict with the Canal Commission and with the president, which is a kind of conflict one probably shouldn't get into. He was replaced by John Stevens. John Stevens came from the Great Northern Railroad. He had laid out the Great Northern Railroad across the Rocky Mountains, so he had direct experience not in operations of railroads, but in building railroads. He got a $5,000 increase to take on the job, and he lasted really another year and was replaced. And we'll get to that again. But Stevens was really critically important in developing a design for the canal and in starting the construction. And when he looked at the French, what the French had done, here are some quotes from him. I'll read a couple which I think are important. He said the French company fell down because they couldn't dispose of the material. They couldn't move it fast enough. And he looked at their physical plant and he said, I likened the plant of the French to a modern one as a baby carriage is to automobiles. So he scaled up the equipment, but really more importantly, he jumped on the notion of trying to make this a safe working environment. So the first thing that Stevens did was he stopped construction, as really very much the opposite of Wallace, who pushed construction ahead. He stopped construction, turned to William Gorgas and said, clean up the environment, defeat the disease, defeat the mosquitoes. And that happened, and the project was able to move ahead. So there was a period of time when Stevens was in charge where they really weren't doing much in terms of construction, but they were building a context to make construction safe and efficient and fast. Stevens was a railroad design guy. He laid out the railroad so that empty trains were pulled upslope where more energy was needed. Loaded trains were rolled downslope. The rail fleet grew to 135 steam locomotives, 1,500 one-sided flat cars, which, and I showed you an example of that. This was a really busy railroad operation because moving the dirt was the problem. Spoils trains operated at a frequency of 20 per hour, very, very often. Coal trains and supply trains moved at night. There are 76 miles of track in the 9-mile Calabria cut, where construction was most intensive. So it's a huge railroad operation. And speed was important to finish the job in a timely fashion. So here are these one-sided flat cars. And on the scene in Panama, an unloading scheme was invited. Here in Panama, an unloading scheme was invented. This was the Ligerwood continuous unloader. Ligerwood was an engineer that worked down there, and he came up with this scheme where a blade was placed at the end of this continuous train full of earth and pulled by a cable to the other end so that the spoils were dumped very rapidly and used either in a waste dump or to create this earth-filled dam or to create the breakwaters at the end. That wasn't the only invention. Ligerwood invented a whole series of devices to increase the efficiency of operations, and devices that weren't used in other places. One of them was a rail shifter, which allowed them to pick up a section of rail and move it 10 feet or 30 feet from one side to the other to adjust it so that it could support the work of the shovels. They didn't take the rail apart, they just picked it up and moved it to another location. I talked about the fact that slides were really important in terms of increasing the workload. This image is a really good one because it shows the extent of a slide at the Continental Divide near the center of the canal. And the watchword was, there's a slide at this location, go out and dig it again. And gradually the side walls of the cuts were moved further out, and the slopes were made more gentle to reduce the likelihood of slides. But slides are not unheard of even now in the Panama Canal. It's related to the nature of the material and the nature of the environment. Remember, this is a federal project, was government funded. Didn't mean there was an infinite amount of money, but it also didn't mean, as it did in the case of de Lesseps, that every time they needed more money, they'd have to go to the financial markets and try to sell more bonds. So while there were cost controls and cost concerns, there was resources to do this. The workers were paid in gold or silver. The higher educated, more professional workers got gold payments. The others got silver, were paid at the scene. It was managed from Washington by the Secretary of War. It was lodged in the War Department. Interestingly enough, at this point in the history of the United States, large infrastructure projects were not funded by the federal government. The Transcontinental Railroad was. There were subsidies and incentives to the railroads to connect the railroads across the country, but other projects were funded at the state level. So this was quite unusual, and it was far from home. And finally, I guess I want to talk about the leadership, because the leadership was really critical in the success of this project. The first chief engineer was John Wallace. I talked to you already about John Wallace. He was trained as an engineer. He got a slow start. He was focused really on the words of Teddy Roosevelt, which were, the quote was, "Let the dirt fly." And Wallace really focused on that. He doubted what Gorgas said, and so the death rate among workers was still high. but he did begin to rebuild the Panama Canal Railroad, which was very important. And as I said, he resigned under fire. He got in conflict with the Canal Commission and ultimately with the president. So he lasted a year, went on to have a great career as an engineer. John Stevens actually had a 2-year term as the chief engineer. I would describe him in baseball terms as the middle reliever. He's the guy that came in and kept the game going and really made a difference. He came from designing and laying out the Great Northern Railroad across the Rockies. Stevens focused first on health, on environment, on supporting Gorgas, on making this the best place to work for engineers and construction workers in the world. He studied the options for canal design and settled on the dominance of the lock canal and lobbied for that. He redesigned the rail system. And he left after 2 years kind of mysteriously. And my own interpretation is he got bored with the job. He could look ahead and see the end and see that this was a project that was going to be finished and finished successfully. He had done all the things that he felt he wanted to do and he could do, and he understood he could make a lot more money doing other things. He went on to another illustrious career. In fact, he went to Russia and built railroads there. And the project was left to the closer, to George Goethals, who was a general in the Army Corps of Engineers. Teddy Roosevelt got frustrated that his chief engineers kept quitting on him, and he wanted somebody that couldn't quit. And so he got a military man. And Goethals, while he credited Stevens with being the canal hero, finished the job because he focused on routinization of construction operations. He consolidated power in Panama so that he had all the jobs and wasn't in conflict with other decision makers, so he could focus on getting the job done. He was the chief engineer. He was the president of the Panama Canal Railroad. He was the chair of the Isthmian Canal Commission. He was the governor of the canal zone. He was the overlord, but he was a benign overlord. He treated his workers very well. He was a master of organization, of delivery, of performance management. So what are the lessons? And I think these lessons are timeless and they apply to us today. Fixing the environment. I need an environment where it's safe and comfortable to work. Coming up with a design that's a successful, cost-effective, feasible design, using the right tools, and picking a strategy that takes us to the finish line. What you see in the success of building the Panama Canal is fact-driven problem solving, figured out the cause of malaria and yellow fever and addressed it, figured out what was the most efficient way to do this job, as opposed to de Lesseps, who came in with preconceived solutions that it turns out didn't work. Here, in this case, evidence dominated opinion, and that's something that's important now. I share with you the picture on the lower right because to me it's another indication of data-based decision-making in the construction of the Panama Canal. This is a scale model for experimenting with spillway designs for the Gatun Dam spillway. In those days, they didn't have computational fluid dynamics. They couldn't analyze a design on a computer. They needed to build models. So they built a variety of models and used that to drive the decision. Here's another engineer in the field dressed as I might like to dress on some hot days, with boots to protect against the mud and a white outfit and a straw hat. So what we walk away with is take care of your people and measure and drive performance through a system of database measurement. So Goethals did that. He monitored the performance of every digging team, every shovel team, reported that weekly in the Panama Canal Record, which is the weekly newspaper, and rewarded his workers for good performance. There was a lot of innovation. Also in machines, this was a project that demanded innovation and it changed the nature of construction technology going forward. A wonderfully interesting project. I encourage you to read about it. Lots of ways to learn more, and I invite your questions because there's a lot more to say about the construction of the Panama Canal. Thank you very much. This is Joseph Schofer again. I hope that you enjoyed that talk as much as I enjoyed giving it for you. We have a lot of really good questions here. I'll try to get through all of them or most of them in the time that we have available. I'm going to start with and I noticed that most of the questions are really about the canal today rather than about the history. So I presume that means you learned all about the history and you want to go forward, which is perfectly fine. First question is given the canal's small size and the patterns of change in world shipping, do I envision a method to enlarge the capacity of the canal anytime soon? Well, if you've been reading the papers and watching the news, the canal was substantially increased in capacity, ending in 2016. A new set of locks was built at each end. The controlling factor in the lock size in today's shipping market is the beam of the ship, the width of the ship. The original locks were 110 feet wide. The new locks are 180 feet wide. So they accommodate, and were really designed to accommodate the largest of the container ships, which is the most lucrative market. There's another question that asks, will the canal ever be enlarged enough to accommodate super tankers? So super tankers, very large crude carriers, are as much as 250 feet wide, and they are way too big to get through the canal. But that was well known when the design for the lock modification was locked in. And in fact, the Panama Canal doesn't represent a trade in crude oil. So there isn't a crude oil flow there by ship, and so the locks weren't built wide enough to accommodate that. But the new locks are substantially larger than the old locks in terms of width, which is really all they needed to accommodate the newest ships. And the flow through the new locks and through the canal as a whole has changed since 2016, so that now the larger ships have been attracted and are moving efficiently through the canal. Number of questions about global warming and how that's going to affect the canal. The principal effect right now is drought and insufficiency of water, and that's a problem. And as you heard in my lecture, water makes it go. The water flows from Lake Gatun, from the top of the terrain in the Isthmus of Panama, out through the two oceans. And insufficient water means that you can't move as many ships. Really what it means is that when the water level is low in Lake Gatun, the Panama Canal Authority limits the draft of the ships, that is the depth of the ships that can move through. And what that means is that ocean carriers have to offload cargo that they can't move it all through. There are a number of initiatives underway to address the problem of drought and finding ways to assure sufficiency of water. A starting point, which is sort of what any private sector marketer might do, is they've changed the pricing structures so that when there's a water limitation, they apply a surcharge to the ships going through. Now, why do they do that? They do that as a kind of an incentive to make sure that ships aren't loaded so they're deeper than they need to be. The draft is larger, but mostly they do it to accumulate money to put into programs to increase the availability of water. And there is such a program underway right now. And in fact, their principal advisor in this is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So we've maintained, despite the fact that Panama as a nation took control of the canal in 1999, we maintain a very strong relationship with Panama and provide advice, not money, but advice and technical skills when needed. Another question is, has the canal ever been closed? Yeah, it's been closed when there have been accidents or the need for repair in the locks, and they may be closed for short periods of time. And in fact, if you go online to the website of the Panama Canal Authority, you will see that they post in advance warnings that one lane or another will be closed for a certain period of time, hours, or perhaps a day or so for maintenance, routine maintenance or emergency maintenance, but not particularly closed for long periods of time. Some questions related to the proposal to build a canal across Nicaragua. So if you dig further into the history than I was able to cover, you'll know that Nicaragua was an alternative route to Panama, and there was really fundamentally a political debate between Nicaragua and Panama. One political group had found an advantage in one place, and another found an advantage in the other. And Panama was chosen, probably a good choice. But Lake Nicaragua is in the middle of the isthmus there, and so it provides similar to what happened in Panama, a fairly long distance where there's no excavation needed. A simple statement that I would offer in terms of the progress of the Chinese project to build the Panama Canal is that I've been tracking and going through the Panama Canal for about 15 years now. And every year there's another news report that says they're going to do it, they're going to do it. And from everything I've been able to detect, there has been no progress. So that's not going anywhere. The nation of Panama and the Panama Canal Authority are watching that very carefully because that would be an important competitor, but it doesn't look like it's going to happen, and the Panamanians are smart enough to respond in clever ways. Another question, which is interesting and takes us back to the construction of the canal, is were there any towns or temples that were relocated or flooded as a result of the construction of the Panama Canal and the building of the dam, which flooded a very large area of the center of the isthmus? And the fundamental answer is nothing significant. It was a rainforest, it was open territory, it was hilly and fundamentally a jungle. So not much was relocated. Some small settlements were relocated, but it didn't create anywhere near the kind of relocation need that the building of dams in China. So I have a couple of questions about climate change. I've addressed that. One of the issues that came up is what about sea level rise? Well, Panama and the Panama Canal have some real flexibility in terms of that. They would be able to raise the top level of the locks if necessary, but they're already well high enough so that they've got a lot of decades, centuries really, before sea level rise becomes an issue. A number of people, again, were concerned about fresh water and my number of 52 million gallons. I can assure you that I've read that 52 million gallons in the published literature, but I did honestly go back and calculate it myself, and it's a right number. And the answer is that it's of concern. The new locks, which are larger, they're longer, but they're wider and they're deeper, have a feature that's built in that saves water. That is, some of the water that drains out of the locks when the ship goes through is saved off to the side in storage basins and used again. So the new locks, while they're substantially larger than the old ones, actually use less water for ships to transit. Let's see, what else do we have? How much quicker could the canal be built with today's technology? Well, today's technology is immensely more capacious, so it could be built much quicker. There were actually talks about expanding the canal that go back as far as 1938. They were shut down, and some effort was started at that point in time, but the Second World War shut that down. There was some conversation, some writing about using nuclear excavation techniques. That fortunately did not go anywhere. But I would say probably this was a 10-year construction process. The new locks alone were about a 4 or 5 year construction process. So it would be that order of magnitude. Again, it would not be a lot shorter. One of the real differences is that we're much more careful about construction safety and environmental management, which would cause a new construction process to be much more cautious. Question about the death rate of construction workers. So I talked in my presentation about the death rates due to malaria and yellow fever. Yes, there were certainly deaths due to construction accidents, partly some of it from slides, a lot of it from accidents with explosives. They use a lot of explosives there. I would have to say I've transited the canal on a ship during the construction of the new locks, and even then we would every 10 or 15 minutes as we went through the canal hear yet another explosion. I don't have numbers on the deaths, but there were certainly deaths, and that's an issue that would slow the construction of a new canal if we use new technology, because standards are much higher. We're much more careful. The Panama Canal Authority is higher, and all the international contractors that would be involved and were involved in construction of the new locks would apply a much higher level of care. The question about moving some of the container shipping that's going into the West Coast of the United States that fills our stores to the Gulf Coast, Houston, Galveston, Mobile, Miami, Charleston, Norfolk, New York. And the answer is, the question is that a feasible option? And the answer is it's done all the time, particularly when we experience the heavy congestion and the slowdown, the meltdown really of the supply chain as a consequence of COVID-19 and the changes in consumer purchasing patterns. Some traffic was moved to the East Coast to avoid those delays. So the fact that Panama Canal Authority expanded the locks, built an expanded set of locks, meant that some of the largest container ships could transit the Panama Canal. The dominant ports for inbound container shipping are Savannah, Norfolk, and New York. New York is probably number one, Savannah is number two, and Norfolk number three. The issue, it gets interestingly complicated because when a container ship with 11,000 or 12,000 containers on board gets to port, you need to have a capability to move it inland and on land to points of distribution and consumption. So the railroad connections are dominant, and they're very strong on the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. They're good on the East Coast, but the patterns are a little bit different. There's a competition between the ports. There's for East Coast and West Coast, no question about it. And shippers, retailers, for example, are starting to pay attention after this experience with the supply chain to the possibility of moving more freight to the East Coast and distributing from there. So it's just like, let's see what else we have here. Did they have to import sand and gravel? Well, they certainly imported the cement to build the locks for the canal. The sand and gravel wasn't all local, but it was imported from places very nearby. So up and down the isthmus, not from distances really far away. Somebody tells me what a grand experience it was to transit the canal on a cruise ship. And I will say that I've done it 10 times and there's nothing like it. It's a spectacular piece of engineering technology. And while you normally wouldn't go through the expanded locks, the new locks, which are very high tech because they're reserved for only the largest ships. Still, what's fascinating is to see the canal 108 or 110 years later and realize that it looks a lot like it looked when it was first built. It's held up very well. Did any women work on the Panama Canal as engineers or as laborers? Probably. Well, I wasn't there at the time. I haven't seen much written about that. I will say that during the construction of the new locks, which, as I said, ended in 2016, the operation was very much an egalitarian operation. So I'm sure that males dominated females in all of the ranks, but there were plenty of women involved in that. And as a civil engineer and as an engineering professor, I will tell you that the future is very bright in the sense that when I walk into an undergraduate engineering classroom, I discover that at least 50% of the students are women. And don't quote me on this, but they're usually the better students. Did they consider building a tunnel at sea level? I don't see any particular advantage of a tunnel. In fact, there's a real serious disadvantage in any kind of enclosed space for a ship, because ships are not only big in terms of width, in terms of beam, and in terms of length and draft or depth, but they're big in terms of height. And the height of the ship from the waterline to the very tippy top of the ship is called the air draft. The word draft would normally mean the depth that the ship requires. And the air draft on some of these container ships is far too large to get under some of the bridges in the ports. So if you know what's going on the East Coast, the entrance to the New York harbor, which is really on the New Jersey side, the freight harbor, cargo harbor, requires ships to go under the Bayonne Bridge, which is a beautiful old arch bridge. And the Bayonne Bridge did not supply the air draft to accommodate the largest container ships. So as many ports, particularly in the East Coast, made large infrastructure investments to open the gates, if you will, to the largest container ships. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey raised the level of the Bayonne Bridge. They didn't build another bridge, but they built another roadway that added something like 50 more feet of air draft and replaced the old airway. And that, if you look at that bridge now, it's an arch bridge. And it looks a little strange because it looks like the road is a little bit too high for the design of that bridge, but that's the new roadway. So yeah, tunnel, not a very good option. There are a few ship tunnels around the world, but the problem is that once you've dug the tunnel, you've got that tunnel and you've got that capacity limitation. That's not really a good alternative. How much does it cost for a ship to transit the canal? Well, that's a really interesting question, and we need a lot of math to figure that out. I will tell you that you can go online to the website of the Panama Canal Authority and see the pricing structure. It's fairly complicated. It relates to the capacity of the ship, and there's a different price for a ship loaded and a ship empty, and they're very clever about this. If you have one container on a ship that can carry 10,000 containers, it's a loaded ship, and you pay the loaded price. And the price per container is on the order of $100, $50 or $100 or something like that. The price for the largest container ships, the toll for the largest container ships going through the new locks can be on the order of $1 million. I've gone through on small cruise ships with 200 passengers aboard, and I've computed the price. The Panama Canal Authority doesn't want to tell me what the price is, but I use their formula, and my math is still fairly good. And the price for that kind of the toll for that a small ship is on the order of $50,000. That sounds like a lot of money, but my experiences on a cruise ship is, when I look at the pricing structure, if you want to go through on a cruise ship and you want to go through in the daytime, which you really want to do, because otherwise it's sort of like going through a museum when it's closed, there's a $30,000 surcharge for guaranteed daytime passage. And my experience is I've been able to walk up and down the decks and say, would you pay your share of that to go through during the day? Yeah, people would really do it. How can they charge that much? Because it's still way cheaper in terms of time and money than going around Cape Horn. So the ship operators pay it, and for them, it's quite worth it. By the way, you pay by wire transfer. You pay in advance. There's no credit involved, and the pricing system is extraordinarily complicated. So you pay for a reservation. You arrive at the time of your reservation, and you're guaranteed passage within a certain short period of hours. If you don't want to pay for a reservation, then it's a first come, first serve. And during the busy season, which is summer and spring and summer, ship can wait for days to find a turn to get through the canal. Question about recycling the 52 million gallons. Well, not with the old locks, but with the new locks. As I said, they save about 60% of the water. So that's a huge advantage, and it puts them in a much better position relative to the drought situation. It gives them a little bit of flexibility before it becomes a crisis. A historical question: when I discussed the U.S. intervention against Colombia, which made it possible to build the canal. Well, the simple answer is no, because I'm a civil engineer, and while I've read the history, I don't claim to be an expert on that. But I think, in all fairness, and I really encourage you to read the history, and I'll make a suggestion about that in a moment. in all fairness, we stole the canal. I mean, we really interceded. This land was owned by Colombia, and we interceded in a what was a fomented revolution in Colombia to prevent in Panama to prevent the Colombians from keeping their land, which in 1999 was the rationale for effectively giving back the canal to Colombia. So here's a question that I haven't gotten, but you should ask, and that is, when people said, "Well, you're going to give the canal to the Panamanians, and it'll fall apart in 2 years." The Panamanians are super organized, super technical, excellent management, very good financial management, technological management, operational management, and running the canal runs very, very well. And the reason is it's their livelihood. Of something like a fourth or a third of the treasury of Panama, or the budget of Panama, comes from the canal. Not just the transit of ships and the tolls, but other services provided and the generation of electricity. Who has the right of way for transit priority? Cargo or passenger ships? One makes a reservation and books a time. You can make a reservation a year in advance, and it's first come, first served based on the reservation. So it's not, for example, it's not like the conflict sometimes between Amtrak and freight railroads, where the railroads themselves want to give priority to freight. The priority goes to the money, and the tolls are very large. The largest passenger ships pay large tolls, but the big container ships pay a lot. I should say that the toll is also driven by what's in the ship. So passengers pay because there's passengers. Container ships pay the most because the cargo has the most value. So if you're looking at a dry bulk ship that may be carrying sand or grain, probably not that, but maybe an agriculture project, so a product like grain, that goes at a lower toll. But it's not a matter of the good guys go first and the bad guys go second. It's a matter of a very orderly transit through the canal. I think we've got all the questions answered. I've really enjoyed talking with you in this interesting way. I would encourage you in your spare time to pick up David McCulloch's book, The Path Between the Seas, which is a marvelous history of the building of the Panama Canal. He dwells much more on the political history than I'm able to do, and I learned a lot from him and then took it from there and learned about the technical and engineering history. Glad to talk with you today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to hearing about your trip through the Panama Canal.